Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Werme.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, part of the Bet the Board podcast network. And oh, what a show we have for you guys and girls. A fantastic interview. And for the first time in Stay Green history, a former Cup champion jumps into the hot seat. More about that in a moment. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by professional NASCAR bettor and racing analyst extraordinaire Chris Werme. And Wormser had a lot of fun talking to Kurt Busch and getting his perspective on the sport. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy the interview that we have scheduled for Stage 2 today.
Kurt was great. You know, I think that for NASCAR fans, it's kind of interesting to reminisce with a driver that, you know, was such a big part of every Sunday for NASCAR fans over the last 15 or 20 years, or actually a little more than that. You know, when he started at 2000, 2001. So he's been around the sport a long time. And it was great to hear his perspective and also to see how we do understand NASCAR a little bit more. So you can see the progression of the conversation go from like explaining long run and short runs to basically, you know, where we end at the final part of the interview.
Yep, folks will get to listen to that in its entirety shortly. But before we get to Stage 2, like we always do around here, want to go back for Stage 1 and cover what we saw unfold last week in Dakota. Unfortunately, from a best bet perspective, Austin Cindric gets nicked up a little bit early, doesn't really have a chance to flirt with a top 10 finish, but maybe more frustrating than anything else. And we don't like to cry about spilled milk all that often around here. If you tell me we bet a driver at plus 130 and for us slightly better prices as well, and he finishes second in the race, more often than not, I'm going to think we have a great chance to cash that ticket. But Christopher Bell comes home second, just tenths of a second behind William Byron. And like I always ask you for Stage 1 when we recap, do we think William Byron had the best car? I think you hit it perfectly, though, with your tweet on Sunday after the race.
It's really hard to penalize William Byron. He went out there and did exactly what he needed to do. And this is where you kind of get into a gray area of, did you bet on the best car or who was the best car? William Byron, maybe he was taking it easy towards the end of the race, saving his stuff. That's a possibility. It's just really hard to penalize that 24 team and say, you know what? They weren't the best car because they did everything that you wanted them to do. Now, if you were to take the side of saying that Chris Bell was the better or the faster car. Now, I found myself arguing on Twitter with people outside of my sphere. I didn't realize how intelligent the people that we deal with week to week that talk about betting on NASCAR, just how they're very objective. And then you venture off into where you find just a casual fan that is like William Byron fan 24.
How pretty original Twitter handle there. I can't imagine you'd be rooting for anybody else with a handle like that.
So I found myself saying, well, Chris Bell had the fastest lap of the race by 0.2 of a second. And it wasn't because he didn't or that William Byron didn't have clean air. He had clean air the whole day. He also had the most fast laps at 17. Also, the final pit stop, Chris Bell was 2 seconds slower than William Byron. And so all of those things kind of add up to the fact that Chris Bell only lost by, half a second. I still think Chris Bell was probably the best car, but it's impossible to penalize the 24. If I could go back, or if I'm Ryan Stevens or at Ryan Stevens, if I'm Adam Stevens and I go back, I don't know. I don't know if winning Stage 1 was worth it, because you get playoff points for winning the race too. And he kind of gave those up when he went out there and won the first stage.
Yeah, but I think you leave too much to chance. Look, Christopher Bell had a fast car. I think they believed the two-stop strategy could pay off. And while he was able to shave, that major deficit, you raised the right question there. when you wonder, did William Byron just go out there and do enough, saved his stuff, that if Christopher Bell got to his rear bumper, Byron knew he had a little bit more left in the tires after Christopher Bell had to burn everything off. But
which is entirely possible. Like, I'm not sitting here saying that William Byron wasn't, or, was or wasn't saving his stuff. There's a really good chance that if the 20 gets to his back bumper, Byron says, all right, I'm out of here. And he maybe pulls that out to 8 or 9 tenths. And then, he was saving his stuff. So I think this is where, it's getting hard to say who the best car was. If you bet Chris Bell, I don't think you were wrong. But if you thought that William Byron was going to run a mistake-free race and starting on the pole and he's good enough on road courses, I mean, that was a hell of a bet as well.
Eventually this season, we're going to get a race on Sunday when odds reopen after practice and qualifying, where it's not going to be a 4-1 shot that's grabbing the checkered flag. You and I joked about the efficiency of the NASCAR market, but maybe it's a sign that the fastest cars are going out there and winning these races. We'll see if that holds true this weekend at Richmond. One final thing that I do want to ask you before we close the book on stage 1 was about Chase Elliott. And I think we look at the 9 car. We talked a little bit last week at this time about his price going in. Is it fair to say that Chase Elliott in the next gen car can't be considered a tier 1 road course racer? Or do we think that we didn't get an accurate reflection of what we saw after he exceeded track limits with a car that maybe had a chance to finish on the podium if things broke the right way?
I'm going to say I think at Watkins Glen, I do anticipate Hendrick Motorsports, Chase Elliott, and Kyle Larson to be really good. But when it comes to more of these technical places like COTA, like Sonoma, I think they're a bit off from some of these other guys. And, Reddick also, I still think Reddick's lost a little bit to the field. If you were to, let's just say we go back to 2022 and 2023, and you were to say Reddick were to qualify in the top 3, you think, well, he's going to lead a lot of laps and win this race, but he did nothing but kind of fade back to that 4th or 5th place spot and kind of hang out there the rest of the day.
Yep.
It's amazing how much these road course ringers, they change from year to year. And, that just might be a part of the sport now. Or if it's just these young guys that spend a lot more time in the simulator. I know that Denny on his podcast said, well, he can't go to the simulator 5 days a week, which, I mean,
look,
okay,
Denny is also running a race team as well. So there are different responsibilities on his plate than some of the younger drivers, especially having a wife and kids, which is a distinct difference from a William Byron that's focusing on racing first and foremost.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that there's kind of this youth movement that, hey, let's go be good on road courses, because if we work on it, you can see it pay dividends right away. And you see 6 road courses throughout the year. You might as well just go get good finishes. And I think we've seen these younger guys take advantage of it. And I think we'll see Chris Bell up there most of the season when it comes to these road course races.
Well, we'll wave the green, white checkered flag on stage 1 and go right into stage 2. We teased the interview with Kurt Busch at the top of the show. Without further ado, our conversation with a former NASCAR Cup Series champion, Daytona 500 winner, and someone that also has an Indy 500 top 10 on his career resume. Thrilled to welcome on our guest for this week's episode of Stay Green, a man who needs no introduction, but we'll give him one anyways. NASCAR fans know this driver well. A man who in his Cup career, he's a Cup champion. He's a winner of the Daytona 500, 30-plus Cup races to his resume. Kurt Busch, who you can follow on Twitter at Kurt Busch. And Kurt, can't thank you enough for jumping into the Stay Green family to try and figure out everything that NASCAR is struggling with over the next 30 minutes or so.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. I'll do my best to help you guys out. But, our sport goes through a lot of changes, whether it's old veterans retiring, new kids coming in, new designed car, aero. But NASCAR always tries to find little things to help keep things interesting and to tweak it. And it happens more often now than what it used to in the past.
And that's the one thing, and Chris, I'll give you a chance to jump in asking Kurt, some more pointed questions. But I think NASCAR deserves a ton of credit. And I think what we saw this year at the Clash, them being able to pivot the entire TV schedule to get that event in on Saturday night, spoke volumes about a sport that maybe we don't see that during a normal points-paying race. But to understand how important to get some of those marquee events in, know that we all deal with Mother Nature. And I think that showed a lot about the malleability for the sport and their willingness to kind of adjust on the fly. And look, we saw it a couple weeks ago at Bristol, those tires deteriorating at a much more rapid clip than anybody anticipated. We'll hope that they are slightly more aggressive with some of those tire compounds. But Chris, go ahead. I know you had some questions for Mr. Busch that you wanted to try and get off your chest.
Yeah, Kurt, I want to talk about your last win. Obviously, the Cup Championship in 2004, Daytona 500 in 2017. Where does this win for 23XI kind of fit in the hierarchy of achievements? And not a fluke, too. I mean, you went down and ran down Kyle Larson, someone that had won 10 races the season before. Where does this kind of fit just on your hierarchy of successes in your career?
It's the top 5 moment for sure. You know, to almost be on the brink of retirement. And then when you get a phone call from a guy named Michael Jordan, Denny Hamlin, you know, with Monster and Toyota, everybody's like, hey, we want you to start up a team. We know that you only want to drive for 1 or 2 more years. It was a dream come true. And to meet MJ, the discussion was so smooth. It was so simple. And he says, you know, you race from here. That's the way I played the game. We need you to do that with our new team. And so to win at Kansas, I think that was like our 10th race. And yeah, I ran down Larson and my little brother. So Kyle,
yeah, that's true. Yeah, the Kyles. Yeah, the
Yep.
Kyles. And then an awesome paint scheme. I'm not a paint scheme guy. I've never been like, oh man, it's so what a great. But for someone that grew up loving Jordans and always like that was just a part of the popular culture growing up in the 90s, to see that paint scheme and know that is just a pure Jordan car, to see that in NASCAR and see it win was awesome.
One of the funniest parts was Denny Hamlin, who's part owner of 2311. He texted me. He goes, dude, I'm so jealous. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Because your paint scheme is so baller for Kansas. Go out there and go do it. So it was a magical type of weekend for us. Like right away in practice, car felt solid.
You know, Chris, Denny has plenty of Jordan brand gear represented. I mean, what he put out on Instagram earlier season, I'm sure you saw it, Kurt. The amount of shoes that man has in his closet, I mean, he's going to need to build another wing to his home and another gym to try and take care of it. But you mentioned running down both Kyle Larson and Kyle Busch. What's it like when you're out there week in, week out racing, not only against 30 plus other extremely talented drivers, but your brother? And, you know, how differently did you have to race Kyle when it was you and him trying to vie for the checkered flag more often than not?
In that setting, you know, every race, every track is different. And you have to find those little nuggets that make big differences. And my car ran really well from lap 15 to the end of the tire run, where those guys were stronger for the first 15 laps. So I was just like, you guys go ahead. I'll let you guys duke this out. And they burned up their tires racing each other so hard. And I learned that from how I lost the race in the fall, the previous race there. So you always build just kind of like lasagna. If you find layers to be smarter and to have that advantage over the others. And so I was able to, you know, make the outside work on Kyle, my brother, but he gave me that room because he knew he exhausted his tires.
Yeah.
And then Larson, that's going to be like a fencing duel of how you get by him because he's one of the smartest out there.
So is that similar to the opposite of your Coke 600 victory back in 2010, where you were really good on the short run, but McMurray, he was great on the long run. So fortunately, you had a short run to the end. So is that kind of similar to that, but just the opposite? You were on the Kyle Larson and Kyle Busch side of things. Fortunately, it ended in a short run. You just got the long run there at Kansas.
Yeah, that Coke 600 car was incredible. It was one of those where you drive down into turn 3 and it's like, wow, it's still stuck. I'm going to go harder. You drive it down in there further and it's like, wow, it's still stuck. So yeah, that you never know when or why what translates to short run or long run speed, but basically it's the aggressiveness in your shocks and your springs. And if you're more on the firm side, then you're going to have a shorter run. And then if everything's softer and a bit more lenient, then you can be better on the longer run.
I mean, when we look at the nature of the sport, Kurt, I mean, winning races isn't easy. I mean, essentially everybody's going to go out there and 30 plus drivers are going to leave the track every Saturday or Sunday disappointed. We see some of the biggest names in the sport right now kind of suffering through long losing streaks. Brad Kay going through a little bit of a transition, trying to revitalize the racing program at RFK. And we saw Chris Busch really reap the benefits last year. Alex Bowman trying to get his feet back under him. We know Chase Elliott now staring down a drought. During your career, you know, how did you go about determining success on a week in, week out basis, knowing that you'd won a boatload of races, that you'd been at the pinnacle of the sport? I mean, we hear Denny talk about an action's detrimental all the time. The one thing missing from his resume is that championship. And it's almost like people want to scoff at drivers who are winning 30, 40, or 50 races in a sport that's probably more competitive now than it was way back in the early 2000s by a country mile.
Yeah, the way that the rules have changed, or the manufacturers now have a bit more control in what they're supplying the teams. The even playing field right now, it seems like it's this much between first and 15th. And then that gap of 15 to 25, it's right there as well. The competitiveness is pretty wild. And, our group back in the day at Roush, like we had 5 teams and all 5 of us made the playoffs one year. I mean, it was like you were fighting in-house for who was going to have the most success. And that's when it gets political in a small way, at the race shop. But, when I switched to Penske, this is a weird story.
Hey, Kurt, we love weird stories around here. So the weirder, the better. So by all means, the floor is yours.
Yes, I switched to Penske, and when I got there, they didn't have the suspension evolved into the coil binding, where the cars were lowered down onto the springs, and then the springs would catch the car. I'm like, wait a minute, you guys haven't been doing this? We were 2.5, 3 years behind right when I showed up. I'm like, oh, wow, this is going to be a project. And luckily, we did win a race at Bristol early in the year, but a short track, that's more of a conventional setup. And Bristol's one of my favorite racetracks. And so, but yet that whole season in 06, I knew we had to work to catch up to everyone. And so by summer of 07, we were back rolling. Like 07 was one of my strongest years at Penske. And it was just a time and a commitment to get everyone back on the same page on what's the cutting edge setups.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I want to kind of stick with this politics thing because we saw it a little bit last week with Ty Gibbs kind of maybe holding up Chris Bell a little bit at COTA. Chris Bell clearly had the fastest car. Teammates, I know that there's not team orders like we see in F1. How does that kind of fit in and put yourself in kind of both drivers' shoes? What do? Because if a caution comes out, you definitely want to be on the front row where Ty Gibbs would have a chance at winning the race. So you understand fighting a little bit, but at a certain point, seems like it's been kind of green the whole day. You just let your teammate go and see if he can go catch a Hendrick car.
Yeah, and that's where you have to analyze Ty Gibbs, and this is his second year. He's doing a fantastic job, though, with consistency and the smarts he's showing at such a young age. But yeah, he's young. He's not going to give up the spot, even if it is for a teammate who has a faster car. But I got yelled at when I was in the truck series. I was racing so hard to catch a guy at Richmond, and I didn't even look in the mirror for like 30 laps, and I was holding up Greg Biffle, my teammate. And Jack Roush, he got on me afterwards. He goes, you knew you couldn't win, so you got to yield that spot to give our other car a chance to win. And so when you're the young guy, that's going to pop up.
It's such a different dynamic. I mean, Chris, you referenced F1, and of course we see a different pecking order where it's Red Bull and everybody else, and how F1 tries to sell the middle of the pack battle so they can keep their fans engaged. We know in NASCAR, look, if you're not first, you're last in some capacity, and especially for the business we're in. But Kurt, you mentioned, some different tracks. And I know from Chris and I, from a selfish standpoint, if we had a chance to design the NASCAR schedule, we would basically rotate between Homestead and Darlington, maybe go to Bristol once or twice, get a little Dover in there, but we would throw out super speedways. We'd throw out some of the 1.5 mile tracks like Texas. What were some of your favorite tracks to run at, and tracks that you saw pop up on the schedule and you went, you know what? We're just going to try and get here unscathed. We don't want to try and end up in a wreck. And if we get out of here with a 15th place finish, we are more than okay, because I'm not going to spend the time preparing for a track that's not going to impact the overall way that we judge the success or failure of a particular season.
Well, in the playoff era, those final 10 races are the most important. And if there's any spring race that's on the schedule, that's also part of the playoffs, that's a big emphasis weekend. That's a large focus. You're hopeful that you get a Goodyear tire test, or back in the day, you could choose to test at tracks that you felt like were your weakness. That's the way I approached it. Was like, hey, Jimmy Finning or my crew chief, Steve Addington at Penske, back in the day, it's like you could choose where you wanted to go. And I would ask to go where we were weaker. So that was like Martinsville. Like that track kicked my butt forever. Vegas, my hometown. It took me 20 years to win out in Vegas. But then, like you said, Bristol, I go there and it's just like a duck to water. Like that place spoke to me. Places like Charlotte, I love that racetrack with the banking. New Hampshire, a flat track. So most of my wins early in my career were at short tracks, and then most of my wins later in my career were at mile and a halves. I don't know what it was or what that's about, but that's just the way it turned out. And a lot of it, I guess, is because I grew up on short tracks, and so that felt more comfortable.
So we, as gamblers, like to think that we have an edge by looking at track history. If you had to get in the car one time and race at one track, what car would it be and what track would it be? Would it be old Atlanta? I know you're pretty successful there. Old Texas? Like, what were you won kind of everywhere, so it's really hard to kind of pinpoint your favorite track. But to me, it was usually high tire wear. Put the car in the driver's hands. I linked back to Bristol 2 weeks ago, and you see the guys that finished in the top three. You got Denny, you got Truex, you got Keselowski. I'm like, well, shit, if Kurt Busch was here, he would be right up there with those guys, kind of fending off the courting and racing for the win. So what would be your favorite track if you had to go out and win tomorrow?
You're exactly right. I loved the high degradation tracks where the tire drop off would come into play. You had to manage that and evaluate the laps left versus how many are going to be to this next stage, whatever. You had to manage the tires. And so, yeah, Darlington, Rockingham, my first ever time at Rockingham, I am the fastest in happy hour practice, but I was getting lapped by Dale Jarrett at lap 30 because I smoked my tires. And everybody's like, yeah, you got to learn the track. And so if I had just one pick, it would be Bristol, the Bristol night race. That place is so much fun. And the way the tire didn't rubber in the high groove, that was very interesting this time around, even though they said it was the same tire. So the tires have always been an interesting catch-22 because Goodyear needs to build a tire that is durable and is quality, because you don't want mom and pops watching a race going, oh, wow, that Goodyear tire blew out. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So the tires are our biggest State of the Union issue right now.
It's so wild when you see it, because drivers, we hear all the time, Kurt, echoing your same sentiments about, hey, we want more control of the car. And in the next gen car, we know that everybody is separated by the slimmest of margins. It almost feels like on a week in, week out basis, it's the driver that makes fewer mistakes, not necessarily the fastest car that's going to get to victory lane. And that's kind of music to our ears as better. So when we look at the current construction of the schedule, we know that, look, the last couple of years on Easter Sunday, we've gone to the Bristol Dirt. I think, I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I know from Chris and our standpoint, we're thrilled that the dirt's off the schedule, so we get Bristol on the concrete, especially given the way that race played out. But if you're looking at the schedule right now, do you think NASCAR has a good mix? Are there certain tracks you'd like to see added? Are there certain dates you'd like to see taken away? One of the biggest hot button issues is, of course, the championship in Phoenix, and will it relocate? Will Richmond lose a date? We know that NASCAR is going to try and find a way to maybe bring the All-Star race to Bowman Gray, but some of those traditional tracks you'd like to see added or specific dates maybe get removed and go, hey, look, we've been to this venue once. All we need to do is go there once every year at most to try and spread out a little bit and try some different surfaces.
Yeah, think of it this way. Like if you have two dates, a family's going to go, hey, there's a race in April. There's a race in October. We got to go to so-and-so's wedding. Maybe we'll catch, the October race. Mm-hmm. And then something else pops up, and they're not encouraged to go as much. If you're not selling out at a NASCAR race, then you don't need to have two dates that hold up the schedule, because there's so many other tracks that can fit within our system that have the infrastructure as far as grandstand seating, restrooms, amenities, facilities, roads in and out. Those are key things that we need to still make sure our fans have a good feeling and a good memory from the event, getting there, the actual race, and then leaving.
Yeah, Chris, it almost feels like that's where NASCAR is caught between a rock and a hard place, because Phoenix, the racing may not be anything that we write home about, but credit to what they've done there. They sell out the race. They do a great job of marketing it. You get off a plane in Phoenix, even for the spring race or the championship. There's signage everywhere, and those lots are filling up. I know the aerial shots before Bristol, not exactly great when you didn't have the full allotment of RVs and campers out there, but Chris, I know you had a question for Kurt in terms of what he accomplished once, and we're going to have a very prominent NASCAR driver attempt to do the exact same thing this Memorial Day weekend as well.
Yeah, you've done the double, and we have in my opinion, one of the most talented drivers in the world across, all forms of motor racing competing. If you're, what advice would you have for Kyle Larson, and what are your expectations for him this Memorial Day weekend?
Yeah, I'm really engaged with him right now. I actually been texting him, throwing a little advice here and there. One key element that I learned by just going through the process, I won in NASCAR back in April of the year I did the Indy 500. Well, that locks you into the playoffs. So he won at Vegas earlier this year. Now his mindset is that's clear. The distraction of the whole month of May is tough because NASCAR schedule goes to Richmond, Talladega, Texas, Darlington. I don't know the exact schedule, but the month of May, you're at a NASCAR race every weekend, and then you're at Indy every week practicing, qualifying, and preparing. So the travel, it gets bonkers. Like I woke up one time in my motorhome at Indy, and I go, what car, what track, what am I doing today? I was lost. But the day of is actually pretty easy.
Hey, look, I mean, what you guys do, it amazes me. 1 wheel, 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 5 wheels. You go out there and you throw the best drivers and equipment. It's simply incredible to see what you were able to do finishing 6th in that Indy 500. But Kurt, we have to ask you some of the hard-hitting questions now. And for everything that NASCAR does well in its current state in 2024, if there's one thing that you could change with the sport, what would you like to see the sport change? Whether it's the weekend racing schedule, whether it's the schedule of races, equipment, the floor is yours. We put you in the top seat to change one thing in NASCAR. What are you looking to try and change?
Oh, I thought you were going to give me like 20 things to change.
Oh, look, I wanted to make it easy for you. If you got 20, I'm happy to sit here. We can put together a laundry list and we'll send it along to the France family as soon as we're done recording.
I like horsepower. I like when we were getting close to 1,000 horsepower. We were twisting the engines 10,000 RPMs at Martinsville for 500 laps. The horsepower side of it is just continues to get shaved off. And that the era where I won most of my races was the big horsepower. We were ripping around Michigan, topping out at 217. I mean, like guys like Austin Dillon would come up to me and goes, dude, why are you so good at all the fast tracks? I'm like, I don't know, I just throw it down in there.
Yeah, see the skinny thing on the right? I don't let off that.
Hammer down. So no, the horsepower would be one thing, but NASCAR wants to keep it within a decent range in case a new manufacturer like Honda or Audi comes in and they can build the 650 horsepower engine.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to see. I mean, we'd love a little bit more control in the driver's hands, and I think, you guys would as well. But we definitely have seen the horsepower discussion take center stage. Tires, no doubt, a big part of it. So we'll see exactly the direction NASCAR wants to go. When we look at some of the other stuff that's going on in terms of changes, we know that sports betting right now is a hot button topic. And we're not going to put you in the hot seat and ask your opinion on Shohei Ohtani and the press conference he gave earlier this week with the Dodgers. But you're a Vegas guy. You grew up around gambling in one capacity or another. But when you look at the drivers, the teams, and the leagues, how can they all benefit from a healthy relationship between NASCAR and its gambling partners and use it, in your opinion, as a form of fan engagement as we look for other creative ways to try and take that casual NASCAR fan that may tune in to 12 to 15 races to watch a few more minutes each week, a few more races, and maybe even get them involved in, Truck Series and Xfinity as well on Fridays and Saturdays?
You said it right there. It's engagement. It creates another category for race fans to stay engaged and to get further into detail and to learn more about our sport. People that love baseball, they bet on it because they know certain things. With our sport, it opens up this nice category for new people to learn more and want to figure out, oh yeah, this is a high tire drop off track. So Kyle Larson and Kyle Busch are kind of good here. Or this is a super speedway and Bubba Wallace is one of the best on the super speedways right now. Or Ryan Blaney has solid averages at the super speedways. Yeah. So it helps people get engaged, and everyone wants numbers. Everybody wants things at their fingertips. I like it.
Chris, go ahead, man. Jump in there.
How much when you're, I'm I've been betting on NASCAR for the first year that I watched NASCAR was your Coke 600 year. I didn't grow up watching the sport, but I've watched every practice, every qualifying since in every race since 2010 across all series. So
other than, hold on, Chris, that comes with a caveat. Other than super speedways, you've made it abundantly clear you don't watch Atlanta. You try not to watch Dega and Daytona, so you don't want to. You have to, so you can resist the temptation of betting them. Yes. But go ahead, continue.
I stand corrected. I think super speedways are very difficult to predict. Although I think that it deserves to be in racing. I think that it's been a part of the sport for a long time, whether it's restrictor plate races or tapered spacers, whatever they are. I do think that it's a skill. I wish there weren't two of them in the playoffs, just because I do think that you're kind of shaking the 8 ball there. And, you could see potentially someone that had a great season make a few mistakes in super speedway races in the playoffs and maybe not find themselves in the final 8 or the final 4. But when it comes to information that NASCAR can offer, back in, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, they used to offer SMT data in a package called RaceView, and it was like $139 a year. And it was like the greatest amount of money I ever spent. Could you see NASCAR maybe implementing just more information? Because as gambling gets just larger in the NASCAR's view, we're going to want more information. I think people are willing to pay for it if it's available. So what else do these teams have that maybe that without showing their hand could kind of help, inform bettors of who might be good on a particular weekend?
Yeah, there's easily a half a dozen more resources and information that our teams have than what's out in the general public. And so whether it's average lap time, short run speed or long run speed. But yeah, you can get into the numbers. And yet the teams, though, have these little nuggets. And I could have told you, like at COTA, the top 4 separated themselves all throughout practice. Yeah. And then they did it again in the race. But you never know what the strategy side of it. Christopher Bell chose to run that little alternate strategy, but it's because he had the pace. So basically, just you look at the pace in practice these days, and that will tell you the most. That gives you the best percentage chance.
Do you think Adam Stevens, looking back at that race, had he known that it was going to come down to just half a second, do you think he still goes out there and wins stage 1? Because I think if he's on the same strategy as William Byron, I don't know if he wins the race. You can't say that for sure, but knowing that it came within, half a tenth or half a second, do you think he's wishing that maybe he had maybe not won stage 1 and just tried to win the race?
One thing that happens at road courses, if you're a winning team already in the season, like Christopher Bell, like William Byron, they're just targeting the end finish. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if you get a chance to win a stage, that's one quick point that goes with you for the rest of the playoffs. So go grab it because it's early in the race. Yeah. And I think the strategy on the 20 was the same when he won the Roval, if I'm not mistaken.
It was.
It was a slightly alternate strategy, got a lucky yellow.
He got a caution.
Yeah. And
so he gets the caution, it's over. I don't think that's any I don't think anyone, but when it was the Roval, he got a caution, then he got another caution. So he pitted to take tires, kind of like Kyle Larson in the Xfinity series last week, where he changed the tires. Okay, let's take our medicine. We're back in 20th. But that Xfinity series, you put Cup guys there. I mean, you see how many mistakes were made in the Truck Series and in the Xfinity Series when it comes to track limits over the weekend. And then you see the Cup guys. It is crazy how damn good the Cup guys are, how much fewer mistakes they made. You have less cautions. I think that, when it comes to track limits, Denny had his take on actions detrimental, like the, what did he say? Like the obvious rule or something. If it's on a restart, and someone's getting forced off the track, maybe we don't need to penalize them. Or Chase Elliott kind of gets bumped and loses track limits. He gets penalized. So how do you feel about these track limits that we saw last week at COTA?
I went to a Formula One race a few years back and went into the control area, and it looked like double NASA with cameras, TVs, observers. They had 3 cameras on every corner: entry, apex, exit. I don't know why we don't have that technology. And just watching F1 recently, one driver tried to make a pass and couldn't make the apex and just went through the painted area and then yielded and gave the spot back. There you go. If you give the spot back and police yourself, then everything should work out. But sometimes I'm baffled by NASCAR's rulings, but if they have a hot button item and they say it's turn 4 and turn 5, but nowhere else, you make sure you don't mess up in turn 4 and 5.
Yeah, it was wild to watch. You mentioned the Xfinity finish and then seeing Austin Hill getting into the dust up with SVG, him repaying the favor, and then, of course, the 30-second penalty that came late. But to your point, Kurt, we see it in F1 all the time that if you gain an advantage by cutting a corner, you give that spot back and we go ahead and continue to race going forward. Now, I know racing is your passion. It's one of the biggest things. It's a huge part of your life, but you're also a massive baseball fan. And we're on the cusp of opening day. I mean, I grew up in Chicago, but full admitting here, I am not a Cubs fan by any stretch of the imagination. Your rendition of the 7th inning stretch, far better than what we saw from Jeff Gordon and Danica Patrick. So you get a golf clap for that, to say the least. But how did you develop such a passion for baseball? I mean, I know you've been to I want to say 30 plus stadiums over the course of, your lifetime. And I know you bleed Cubby blue. And while the prospects may be good for the Northsiders this year, where did some of that passion for baseball come from? And maybe more specifically, being a Cubs fan growing up in Las Vegas.
Is this conversation over because you said you're a White Sox fan?
No. It's worse. You're going to have to brace yourself. Not a White Sox fan, but my old man's from New York, so I grew up a Yankee fan. So there was no rivalry with the Yankees and Cubs, but I am definitely not rooting for the South Side.
I love it. I love it.
Now, growing up in Vegas, I had WGN TV. I'd come home from middle school and it'd be a soap opera, news, Cubs. I'm like, wow, these Cubs must be good. They're on TV every day.
Little did you know.
Yeah. And so my family's from the northern suburbs of Chicago, Schaumburg, Rolling Meadows, Arlington Heights. And so my uncle would always take me to AAA games in Vegas and just the Cubs. Like, I remember when the White Sox changed their logo to be like the Raiders, and my mom bought me a Sox hat. I put it on, I looked at it, and now I'm a Cubby. I am a full-blown Cubby.
Hey, I mean, look, the red and blue White Sox logos that Carlton Fisk and company used to wear at the old Comiskey Park, those were iconic. But I'm with you. The black pinstripes have never really grown on me in any capacity for a baseball team, but the Reinsdorf family has plenty that they have to sort out on their own. And Chris, I'll give you final word for Kurt, who's been so gracious with his time and really opened my eyes in terms of what we look at on a week in, week out basis. Although I feel like NASCAR is holding out on some of that data that we could have at our disposal.
I know. Yeah, that'd be great. Well, Kurt, you're involved with 23XI. Is that still something you're doing, weekly?
Yes. Yeah. There's Monday meetings, Wednesday, like right after this is a data analytics meeting to prep for Richmond. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So you'll send over the link for that, and then we'll be able to pop in and take a look at that as well. But what's next for you? What do you see, 5-10 years from now? What's on the docket for Kurt Busch?
Yeah, this has been a fun year for me. Last year wasn't so much fun. I didn't know my role, didn't know where my spot needed to be. My soul told myself, I was done racing, and I was going to be done at the end of 2023. So here we are in 2024. I'm a consultant with the race team. I've got an endorsement with Monster, so I'm doing different appearances here and there, having fun, doing different things with Toyota behind the scenes, helping with driver development. Toyota has the biggest infrastructure and the biggest commitment to helping youth and to help the young racers find their way, whether it's in NASCAR or whether it's in sprint cars. Toyota's heavily involved. So I'm there throwing down different advice here and there.
Awesome.
I'm just kind of a jack of all trades right now, and I don't know what 5 years will bring. My little nephew is 9. Brexton has been on a tear, winning races left and right. And, if I can live vicariously through him, I want him to go to F1, I want to go travel the world here
There you go.
No, it's been incredible. I mean, anyone who easy for me to say, follows you, Kyle, or Samantha knows that Brexton has been a rapidly rising star when it comes to motorsports, and it's been great to see. One last question. You mentioned about Toyota racing development, and we've seen Toyota talk an awful lot and put a ton of effort into Tony Breidinger. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing her name wrong. When we look at the sport and diversity, we've seen Daniel Suarez as international driver. We've got a little bit of that, in some of these road course races as well. Do we think she fits the bill to be the next female to try and race at the highest series? And we know you shared some time at SHR with Danica Patrick as well. But when we look at, a woman getting back into the Cup Series, do we think she makes the most logical sense, or is there another superstar that we should be paying attention to if we're looking at some of the other series?
No, she puts in the work. I've seen it. I went to the gym after my injury with Toyota's gym and working on all my vestibular movements. And I went one morning at 6. I just wanted to go super early and mix up my routine. And there she is. She's leaving the gym. And she's headed across to go to Taekwondo. She's like, come on, I'm going to kick your butt. I'm like, yeah, girl, you go after it. No, everyone has an equal opportunity in our sport. That's what makes it so unique. Whether you came from a family with money or not, there's teams out there. There's different spots for everyone to fit in. And you still got to perform, though. You still got to get those results. Doesn't matter your skin color or your gender. You got to get the W's. Yeah. That's what it's all about.
You can follow him on Twitter at Kurt Busch. You'll see him in and around the track in his consulting role with Denny Hamlin and Michael Jordan, hobnobbing with the biggest personalities in the sport. His resume in the Cup Series speaks for itself. A former Cup champion, 30-plus races on the resume, and a 6th-place finish at the Indy 500, as if what he accomplished in the Stock Car Series across the trucks, Xfinity, and Cup weren't enough. Kurt, can't thank you enough for being so gracious with your time. We know you are a busy man with plenty on your plate, and always know that the Stay Green door is open should you want to jump back into the hot seat, and the three of us can always powwow and figure out how to solve all the things that we think NASCAR needs to get right.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. No, I really enjoyed it, and anytime, I'll come back by.
What great perspective, Chris, from talking to Kurt and how open and honest he was about the current state of the sport, his role, what some of his goals are now that his racing career is over. But I think my biggest takeaway from all of that was how quickly you had to scramble to try and figure out what the word vestibular meant when Kurt Busch talked about some of his early morning workouts.
Yeah, I almost commented like I didn't see that word coming. I didn't even know what he meant. But I'm guessing some sort of hand-eye coordination. I imagine that would be like where you take the hammer and you like hit the alligators when you're at the arcade. I don't know, but great stuff from Kurt. I thought it was hilarious how quickly he said horsepower when we said if you could change one thing.
Oh, he didn't hesitate for a second.
I mean, he
didn't hesitate for a second.
He was. Hopefully, we'll have a video of this as we recorded it, but it was almost like as he just was horsepower. As soon as I think he maybe quantified, well, I'm a big fan of horsepower, and so that seems to be something that's very popular with both drivers and fans. Hopefully it's something that NASCAR can respond to. Obviously we understand, the 650 with Honda and Audi. I had never heard Audi potentially and having an interest in NASCAR. I think it'd be great to bring more manufacturers in, more eyeballs in the sport is always great. I wish it wasn't at the expense of the current racing, because we could, especially this weekend at Richmond, see, kind of a conveyor belt where they just kind of, you settle into your position, you get through a long run, and then it turns into a strategy race, which is not my favorite, especially when we come to a place like Richmond with high tire wear, but something we certainly could see.
Yeah, we can't thank Kurt enough for taking time out of his busy day to jump into the hot seat. Some great perspective on all that, and I'm glad that he didn't disconnect when I told him that I was a Yankee fan and not a Cubby fan, although Kurt and his family grew up in a very similar area to me as far as high school conferences were, about 15 minutes away or thereabouts. So when we look at stage 3, Worm, as we always do around here, it's about the upcoming race for the weekend. And the last couple of years on Easter Sunday, we've seen the Bristol Dirt. This year, we'll go to Richmond. I texted you earlier in the day and went, wait a second, this is a night race. Had no idea. Tells you how much I factor temperature and track conditions into some of my handicapping this time of the year. Did feel better, though, when I looked at the forecast and realized it's going to be a hell of a lot different Saturday morning when they do practice and qualifying versus what the racing conditions will look like. But as far as Richmond is concerned, when we talk track specs, it's a D-shaped oval, 3/4 of a mile, short flat track. You mentioned it, high tire wear in Richmond, Virginia. Minimal banking, 8 degrees at the starting line. We have a couple of front stretches. And like always, my logical starting point for this is what other track comps, if any, do you find to Richmond? Does it race like New Hampshire? Does it race like Phoenix? Do you bake in a little bit of Darlington, which is a longer distance but high tire wear? So to create some perspective for those folks handicapping Richmond for the first time.
I think that there's things you can take from a setup at somewhere like New Hampshire. Oh, maybe not so much Darlington, but I do think it's really important to look at Phoenix from this year. We're going to be running that same exact package. And what we saw at Phoenix earlier in the year was kind of some dominance out of these Toyotas when it came to practice and qualifying. And I think we're going to see more of the same. I just don't see a world where the Toyota struggle. And I would say you could even be more specific with just JGR. These guys have been awesome all year long. We saw Chris Bell last week. We saw even at Vegas where Kyle Larson kind of had the best car. You still had a Toyota in Tyler Reddick right there knocking at the door. I think that the Toyotas, you have to kind of have your eyes on them heading into the weekend. Do they unload as fast? But more importantly, do they manage their fall off at a place like Richmond, where there's a little bit more fall off than Phoenix? Can they maintain that throughout a longer run, long green flag runs? I think that these Toyotas are going to be fast this week.
Well, you're really going out on a limb there when you look at the odds board and see the Toyotas, at least the 4 from JGR, are basically the race favorites this weekend. So we can kind of call it JGR versus the field, but we'll go a little bit differently here from a team-by-team standpoint, at least early on. So as far as JGR, shop around, Denny Hamlin and Christopher Bell, more or less co-favorites, upwards of 9-2, some of the best pricing I've seen, some shops under that 4-1 threshold. Martin Truex Jr. right behind them in that 6.5, 7-1 range, and Ty Gibbs taking money pre-week like he seemingly does every single week so far this NASCAR season, despite not having a win on his resume just yet, from 10-1 down to 8-1. So when we look at Bell and we look at Denny Hamlin, I mean, look, Denny has led laps in every single race this season. His average finish the last 4 races is better than 9th. Richmond has more or less been his playground. You can pencil him in for a top 5 finish. But Chris Bell, no stranger to that either. He did come home 20th in the fall race, but before that, 4th, 2nd, 6th, 3rd, 4th. Going back to the Xfinity Series, he ran real well here as well. When we look at Martin Truex Jr., he's won 3 out of the last 9 and posted 6 top 5 finishes at Richmond during that span, an average finish of 7.3 during the next-gen era. And that actually improves as well. If Martin Truex has an extra set of tires left in his pits where he went from 1st place to 11th with a late strategy call there. Meanwhile, here comes Ty Gibbs, an average finish of 7.8 so far this season is actually the best in the Cup Series so far through the first 6 races. So when you look at JGR, I understand they're rightfully priced, but is there one number amongst this quartet of drivers that stands out to you more than others?
Well, I will say it's not Ty Gibbs, and here's why. I tweeted this or posted it on X shortly after the COTA race. What we saw to him in practice at COTA was phenomenal. I mean, his 5-lap average in practice was faster than his fastest lap in the actual race. And that to me says he's just working on being consistent, which I think is great for a young driver. But I don't think he's quite going for wins yet. I think he just wants to be in the mix, find himself in the top, 3 to 5 on the final restart, race his way up there and be in contention. But we haven't seen him really put any pressure on anybody, or we haven't seen him go out there and dominate like we did I understand we did see some of that at the exhibition in LA early in the season. That was a great car. I don't know that he's going to be that good the rest of the year. I don't like this 8-1 price on Ty Gibbs. Now, I do think he can run well enough to maybe back him in matchups, but I just don't think 8-1. I don't think you're getting paid properly on what it's going to take for him to win the race. Same goes for Martin Truex Jr. He wasn't super strong at Phoenix, but he did kind of have a different strategy. That strategy, because it stayed green, did work out well for him, and it was nice to see there have some fall off. And this is the same tire that we're going to have at Richmond this week. It is nice to see that fall off and something work out for Truex. He was able to go from a lap down and drive his way all the way back up to 7th place, but never really a race-winning car, and certainly struggled here last fall. I think that on the first run, after 50 laps in the first run, he had dropped outside the top 10 to like 25th. So I don't know that Martin Truex Jr. is the same guy we saw a few years ago at these short tracks where we saw him dominate at Martinsville, dominate at Richmond. But, man, you get to Chris Bell and Denny Hamlin. I know that it's hard to win NASCAR races, but I also find it really hard to believe that these guys aren't going to be running up there all day long. And I think that the books have this one right. They have the 2 guys, and it was going to be obvious. I don't think there's any surprise that these are the 2 guys at kind of that 4 to 5-1 range. Here's where I think that maybe Denny has a little bit of an upper hand. Denny's not typically great at Phoenix, but he was really good there when he was in clean air. I think if you kind of transfer that to a place like Richmond, where he doesn't necessarily qualify as well, but he certainly works his way up, especially over the long run, I look for Denny Hamlin to be really strong and Chris Bell. I know that that's not saying much, but the other prices aren't going anywhere. I mean, even if they close at plus 375, they qualify 1-2 and look good over the short and long run. So I'm not interested in really any of the Toyotas. I expect them to run well, but I don't think we're sacrificing any value by playing them at this point in the week.
I think that's a great point. We talk all the time when you're looking at some of the pre-week numbers, it's all about building your portfolio, giving yourself options. And hopefully our listeners are doing it a little bit better than you and I did last week at COTA, where we took some prices. And I think 3 out of the 4 pre-week prices we took, we could have grabbed better numbers on race day.
Yeah,
and ironically enough, we did have a little bit of a shot with Ty Gibbs and company, but for the most part, did not build that outright card the right way. When we go from JGR, I think HMS becomes the next most logical place to go. And Kyle Larson is priced at 10-1, William Byron 12-1, Chase Elliott 20-1, and Alex Bowman a long shot price tag of 50-1. And when we look at Larson, look, this hasn't been his best track by any stretch of the imagination. And when we look at the season in a nutshell so far in 2024, 181 of his 224 laps led this season all came at Las Vegas. Wasn't great at Phoenix in this particular package either for those folks that watch. And he's got just 2 combined top 5 finishes in his last 10 Richmond starts. Meanwhile, William Byron, we know him. He's won 2 races already this season, a top 3 contender in this race last year before getting spun out by Christopher Bell with around 20 laps to go. I mean, he's had 114 plus driver rating in each of the last 2 spring races here during the next gen era, and he's starting to accumulate a decent amount of laps led. Chase Elliott, I mean, the numbers continue to drift until the 9 finally gets into victory lane. And of course, Alex Bowman quietly put together a pair of top 5 finishes at Bristol and COTA each of the last couple weeks. He does have a pair of 8th place finishes in his 4 next gen races here at Richmond, but the one thing to keep in mind, even with a pair of 8th place finishes, only has a driver rating north of 81 just once in that 4 race sample size. So when you're looking at HMS, you know, which of these drivers intrigues you early, and which of them raises a couple of red flags as far as pre-week pricing?
Well, I think the one that raises the red flag would be William Byron. Mr. Perfect just can't maintain his perfect races week in and week out. It's really hard to hate on this team because what they look like through the first few weeks of the season is a championship contender. And I know that doesn't make, obvious, that makes obvious sense, but when you're not making mistakes, this car seems pretty easy, especially when you have speed. If you qualify well, you have speed in your race car, and you just don't make a mistake from a strategy standpoint, or you make no mistakes on pit road. Well, this sport seems really, really easy. And there's a lot of guys that don't know what that's like. They don't know what it's like to have a 10-second stop every time you go down pit road. So, but I do think that he struggled here, and I could see him qualifying well, but I can't see him sustaining track position throughout the long run. That's where he's kind of been bitten a little bit. 12-1 is still it's a decent price. I'm just not interested in William Byron until I see something out of the long run out of him in practice. When it comes to Kyle Larson, again, not a great track for him. I mean, I went back and watched the fall race from Richmond this past from the fall. Watched it earlier today. And when you're watching the end of the second stage, you're watching Kyle Larson battle his teammate and Alex Bowman trying to stay in the lead lap, and then Bowman wins. And so Larson's trapped a lap down, and which is crazy because this guy won the race in the spring. So I still think that you also put Phoenix, where he struggled mightily, kind of throw that onto the pile of things where Larson struggled a little bit.
And he struggled at Phoenix in the championship in the fall. So it's not like Phoenix in the spring was just an outlier by any stretch of the imagination.
I mean, when he unloaded, it was like, ooh, we are a 3rd place car, and we've had 3 weeks to work on this. So I just think that you're going to see a better price on Larson, almost certainly live, but definitely after practice and well, maybe not definitely after qualifying, because I could see HMS putting a few cars in the top 5. But I do think that if you have the opportunity to bet live, you will find Kyle Larson at a better price than that. Chase Elliott and Alex Bowman. Chase put together a decent race for him. I can't believe you have to say that. Think about that. You're Chase Elliott. You're the sport's most popular driver. You've won a championship. And I have to say that last year's Richmond race was pretty good for him. I'm pretty sure that's all I need to say. Decent run at Phoenix this year. but also terrible at COTA relative to what we expect out of this 9 car. I need to see a lot out of him in order to get involved in his outright price. I think that, the progression would be, matchups. If you start to trust a guy, you can take him in matchups, then maybe top 5s, top 10s, and then to win. And right now, I don't know that I even trust Chase Elliott in matchups unless it's up against a guy like Logano. But I wouldn't do that this week. We had some success 2 weeks ago on that, but not this week. Alex Bowman, slow clap for that race last week. That guy passed everybody.
He feels comfortable at COTA. Just doesn't go out there,
Yep.
make mistakes. And when we look at road course racing, quietly, Alex Bowman is a guy you have to consider as a top 5 price tag if their books are going to continue to offer the numbers that they have been.
Yeah, and I might be a Bowman apologist. I just think the guy, if there's a restart at that at COTA, Bowman has as good a chance as anyone to come out on top. That guy does very well on late race restarts, and he can hang on. I think he's a really talented driver. I don't know that car is where he needs it to be, kind of fit his liking to where he can make passes and work his way through the field. More importantly, qualify. Are you stressed at all that we're missing out on this Alex Bowman price at 50-1 just because they've qualified so terribly the last the last year he's struggled. So I think 50, if I were to take one of these HMS guys, it would certainly be Alex Bowman. Not a lot of downside at that 50-1 price. I can't see him going off much higher than that. Potentially a little bit of upside, but I still don't think that he's going to qualify that well. If he's going to show up, it's going to be late in the race. It's going to be in the long run. And I think his price before the race will show that if that's the case.
Well, from HMS, let's roll into the RFK camp. And we look at Brad K and Chris Buescher, a pair of drivers, depending on where you shop. Anywhere from the single digits upwards of 14-1 is kind of the best available price that I've seen. And when we look at Brad K, 10th and 6th, respectively, here a year ago, the 6th place finish, you can argue, probably should have been better than where he actually ended up. Won the second stage, led 102 laps overall. It was a bad pit stop in the final stage that crushed any chance of him ending his long winless streak that's still ongoing now. The most impressive thing for Brad, though, he hasn't qualified well, but has shown an ability and a knack for driving through the field to be able to pull that off. Finish 4th and 3rd, respectively, at Phoenix and Bristol so far this season. Meanwhile, Chris Buescher at a similar price, 2 top 3 finishes in the last 3 Richmond races. And that, of course, includes a win after leading 88 laps here last summer. So when we look at RFK, we know these are guys that don't often unload looking like hot rods, but Buescher did it again at COTA. Didn't have race-winning speed, but put together a nice run, picked his way through the field, and comfortably inside the top 10, like we talked about being a distinct possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said they haven't qualified well. At this point in the week, we're not trying to pick the winner. We're trying to pick where the market's going to go. And with both Brad K and Chris Buescher qualifying poorly as of recent weeks, I don't see those prices going anywhere. But they're also 2 guys that I trust that if, let's say they do qualify well and they find themselves inside the top 10 with some competitive Toyotas and maybe throw an HMS car in there, and you do get a price at 9-1, I don't mind hitting those guys if they do feel good over the long run. So Chris Buescher is definitely a guy you can trust. Maybe not sub 10-1, but in that 10-1 range. I don't hate Chris Buescher, but you still need to qualify well. It's just such an uphill battle. When you qualify, let's just say 15th to 20th, the amount of mistakes you can make goes from 0.5 to 0. And it's just so hard to make up track position. When Kyle Larson at Phoenix, when he lost that track position, it's like, okay, let's salvage the day. He had to come back on. I think he had like a loose wheel or something where he had to fix damage, whatever it may have been. Your day is over. And so the margin of error is so small these days. If you stack on the fact you're starting 15th or you're starting 20th, you have a tougher pit stall. You have a tougher entry and exit out of that stall. Throw in a 15-second pit stop, and you're in salvage mode. And so I think it's going to be really important for these 2 drivers, specifically Brad K and Chris Buescher, to qualify well if they want a chance to win this race. And we just haven't seen that yet. I'm not saying that can't happen, but because of that, I just don't think that there's any reason to show any interest in either of those guys yet. Now, after practice and qualifying, could be a different story.
When we go away from some of the main race teams that odds makers have clearly focused on, I think that's where that creates a little bit of intrigue as well. We may as well start with what I'll call the best of the rest.
Yep.
Tyler Reddick driving top tier Toyota equipment. You look at the number and I think it stands out to a lot of folks. 16-1 there on the 45 car, back-to-back starts inside the top 5 last year at Richmond. 81 laps led in the fall, were the first laps he's ever led at this particular track. Was a top 3 performer here in the summer before a pit road penalty late in the race stripped away his promising day. Picked up stage points in 3 of the last 4 stages when we've gone to Richmond, but still seeking his first career top 10, however, trending positively at this particular track. Then we look at Ross Chastain at 20-1 going back to Atlanta. He's got 4 top 7 finishes in the last 5 races. Rinse and repeat here with a driver that I don't think has had a race-winning caliber car, but he's been consistently good, and he's not pissing off the entire field like Ross was prone to do in the past. Just 1 finish better than 18th in the 4 next-gen trips to Richmond, however. Joey Logano, meanwhile, this is a guy that's been the model of consistency at Richmond, and I think he's become one of the tougher balancing acts when you look at a track where he has had a ton of success versus his current form. The market drifted out to 30. That number didn't last. We've seen his future price pop back into place right around 20. Ryan Blaney, his teammate, with a similar number, and you can make the case that this is arguably one of Blaney's worst tracks. Yeah. We know Blaney's improving, raced better at Homestead, which is high tire wear, but if we're talking about that, Darlington has never been great for him when he falls back in the field, and Richmond could be more of the same. Kyle Busch at 25-1. RCR short track program nowhere near where it needs to be, but that didn't stop Kyle from qualifying exceptionally well here. And when we look at Austin Dillon, surprisingly good track for him as well. So when we go through kind of the best of the rest drivers, which one, if any, stand out to you there, which are in terms of drivers to back versus drivers that you want to look to bet against, at least pre-week wise?
Well, my favorite bet, I think outright price, is that Tyler Reddick at 16-1. He's in a Toyota. He ran well at Phoenix, a place where he's been good but not great. I think that he showed over the long run that he was a little bit better than Denny Hamlin. This is also coming off a strong race at Las Vegas where we thought Kyle Larson was going to run away with it. But sure enough, at the end of every stage, Tyler Reddick just found himself right there, at least forcing Kyle to race hard. I think that Tyler is the best outright price. He had a chance to win last year, kind of, gave away those chances at Richmond by, hitting the commitment cone. I like Tyler Reddick. He qualified in the pole. I expect a strong weekend out of him. The 16-1 price. I don't think we'll see 16-1 on Tyler Reddick, come this halfway point of the season. I think that, we'll see him in the low teens at the very highest, week in and week out. He's got a ton of talent. He's showing that he's a very dynamic racer. He's done very well on road courses. He was really good on high tire wear, 1.5-mile tracks where the high line comes in. And now we're starting to see him kind of excel on these road courses, on these short tracks where, a place like Phoenix. And I expect to see him run well this weekend. When it comes to some of these other guys, man, I want a reason to bet Joey Logano here. Like, I'm just looking.
I tried to give you a reason to 30. I told you the number wasn't going to last. You hemmed and hawed, and here we are with Joey Logano at 20 at this point.
I just think Fords are struggling right now. We just haven't seen the speed out of them. If you were to look at a place like Phoenix, where we unveiled this package, that's where Blaney's the best. And we did not see him be the best. We saw him run a very consistent race and, finish inside the top 10, but never a threat to win. And that's when you're betting guys to win the race, you certainly want them to be a threat to win. I'm not saying that there might not be some value in some matchups or maybe some top 5 or top 10 prices, but these guys haven't even shown race winning speed, whether it was Vegas or Phoenix, Bristol for that matter. So I definitely want to see that out of them. If that were to happen, I certainly think that we'll know over the long run, the short 20-minute, A and B practices, we'll at least see someone that maybe isn't falling off quite as much as some of these other drivers. But even if that happens, you still have to put yourself in a position to win the race. And if you find yourself back in traffic for a long time, you could burn a lot of your stuff up and maybe you don't have the same tires that you thought you might at the end of the run. So Chastain, gosh, he's struggled here a little bit, especially when he's been in contention in the playoffs. So, or heading into the playoffs, this is not the place where you bet Ross Chastain, we didn't see a great race out of him at Phoenix. I think he kind of stole his finish in 6th place. He had an 81 driver rating, so nothing spectacular, especially when you look at some of the other drivers at Phoenix, where you had Bell at 125 driver rating, Ty Gibbs at 118, Truex at 115, and Tyler Reddick at 121. That just doesn't scream I have a chance to win the race, especially when I do consider Phoenix this year as a great barometer for how these guys are going to run in this car. Did you cover Kyle Busch? Or
I mentioned Kyle Busch. I mean, this might be
Okay.
the first week you haven't tried to get me to
know.
lead with Kyle Busch when we break down individual drivers. And I figured you were going to profess your love for KFB to Kurt when he was on the program earlier in the day as well.
Yeah, man, Kyle, I just I don't know. I mean, what was he really mad at Chris Bell last week? I mean, what was he saying to him? Like, I know I'm a back marker right now, but you still need to race me with respect. I mean,
Look,
I don't know.
Bell kind of drove into him a little bit there. I'm not sure
know.
who was right or wrong in that capacity, and those two have a relationship that goes back to their KBM days. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. But tell you one thing, Kyle ain't going to forget that. If him and Chris are racing for a checkered flag a little bit later in the season, Kyle may not give him nearly as much breathing room as he otherwise would have afforded him.
Oh, of course. Well, and I think you brought up 10 straight top 10 finishers at Richmond, but as a member of JGR, I think that's a really important part of that whole equation. So I don't know. Again, Kyle, I'm sure that there's people that are going to bet Kyle Busch at 25-1 just because he should never be 25-1. And there's maybe I agree with that, but also I would prefer to see him unload fast and go off at 10 or 12-1, knowing he's going to be in that top 3 or 4 all day long. And that's a number we can pound because you're still going to get paid properly on a guy like Kyle Busch at double digit odds at a place like Richmond. I just think you're kind of gambling at this 25-1. You could steal some value. Absolutely. But he could also qualify well and kind of fade back. We didn't see a ton out of him at Phoenix at all. I mean, geez, obviously a poor qualifying and finished 22nd, a 51 driver rating. I don't know. I just think that it's a gamble to take Kyle Busch at this price.
4 starts in the next gen car at Richmond for Kyle Busch. This has actually been one of his best qualifying tracks. He's qualified second each of the last 2 races last year as a member of RCR, 29th in the summer race with JGR, and qualified 3rd in the first time that he came here in a JGR machine. 9th place finishes, both starts in the Joe Gibbs Racing equipment as part of the next gen era, 14th in the spring, and did finish 3rd here, but didn't lead a single lap here. He's only led 2 total laps the last 4 trips, so something to keep in mind there when you assess the outright prospects for Kyle Busch. And then 2 other drivers real quick, Worm. I don't think either of them require deep dives. When we look at SHR, I think Josh Berry and Ryan Prix, 2 guys that a lot of people are talking about. When we look at Josh Berry, who kind of stole a finish when he was driving as a replacement for Chase Elliott last year in the 9 car, and Ryan Prix showed some speed, put together a good run with a top 5 finish last year. Well, you mentioned the Fords struggling. These guys are long shots and long shots for a reason. Very interested to see what we get out of this tandem. Maybe Noah Gragson and Chase Briscoe as well, as SHR drivers seem to be the most intriguing with the widest range of potential outcomes.
Yeah, I think, yes, widest range of potential outcomes. If the kind of the pedigree that Josh Berry has grown up racing, that's what fits Richmond. So I wouldn't be shocked if he ran top 15. I don't know that he's going to drive through the field and win the race. Ryan Prix did show the world, or the NASCAR world, something last year where he was kind of consistently the 5th, 6th, 7th, or 7th best guy last year in the fall. I do think that both of them have the potential to be good, but the other thing is if the setup's not there's not speed in the race car, and we just haven't seen it out of Ford just in general. And we saw them struggle a little bit at Phoenix. So I can't, I would say I'd be more shocked with a top 10 run than outside of the top 18. I would say that's where I'd put those 2 guys. But if anyone, I would lean more on Ryan. I think that Ryan Prix has more potential upside than Josh Berry. I know that Josh does have this, arbitrary 2nd place finish when he was racing for Chase Elliott, but I don't think that's going to. I don't think it's going to matter much when you're in SHR equipment and in a new package. So I don't know. If I was those guys, I'd be optimistic. But if one thing goes wrong, they could find themselves running 25th really quickly.
Fair way to look at it. You, of course, can follow Chris on X at ChrisWerme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. For all things Bet the Board podcast, be sure to follow the show at Bet the Board Pod. And Wormser, I know we've gone through a bevy of drivers. We've covered a ton of ground with the assistance of Kurt Busch as well this week, recapping last week what we saw at COTA. And when we go to the high tire wear track on Easter evening, a race where we'll drop the green flag after 7 o'clock Eastern time, in terms of identifying some pre-week action, as always, we'll share our race day best bets when the markets are up, the full slate of matchups, and a little bit more liquidity out there. But what are you seeing as a potential opportunity to get our money in with a pre-week price that may not be available when we see these cars unload for real on race day come Sunday?
Well, we're going to pay a little bit of a price here, but I was talking with Ryan Stevens, who not
Adam Stevens?
Not Adam Stevens. I was talking with him earlier.
He doesn't pick up when you call, huh?
And so there's a Denny Hamlin versus William Byron matchup at DraftKings. In all the races, I think it's like 11 races that Denny Hamlin and William Byron have raced at Richmond. Do you want to know how many times William Byron has beat Denny Hamlin?
I'm going to set the over-under at 0.5, and I'm going to juice the under.
You're going to juice the under. That would be right. Denny Hamlin, -150 on William Byron. This is a track where Denny runs this place, and I think that the speed that the Toyotas have had, I think his mentality going into this race, he kind of finished, I don't know, what he was just outside the top 10 last week, knowing that the next 4 or 5 tracks are just Denny Hamlinville. And I anticipate more of that this week. I anticipate him qualifying well. We could see a good qualifying out of William Byron as well, but I think over the long run, Denny is as good as anyone when it comes to conserving their tires. And if we do see an issue like Bristol, I'm not saying that that's a thing, but if it does turn into a race where you really have to conserve your tires, it's not even close. Denny Hamlin is going to be better than William Byron. So I like that. Denny Hamlin, -150 over William Byron on DraftKings.
I've done everything I could all week, Worm. I've scoured every book known to man to try and see if anyone was going to hang some Joey Logano matchups, because that apparently is my man crush for this week. Hoping to get a pre-week price with him as a dog to Chase Elliott. Alas, I did not see that pop anywhere. Screen matchups not readily available, and poking around some of the shops here in my backyard, the matchups felt like Toyota against Toyota laying prices. So I was not real thrilled with the matchup offerings that we had readily available. I'll tell you one thing. One prominent shop offered some top 10 prices that I don't think were necessarily exactly what they wanted to offer. Woke up a Wednesday morning, all the top 10 prices were pulled off the board. Lo and behold, they all resurfaced, and I think the market has since corrected itself.
Yeah,
so
I would imagine.
Some things to think about when we look at everything going on. But one final thing, I know it's the holiday on Sunday for those folks who celebrate. What time can they expect the pre-race pull?
Oh, geez. Wow. Throwing a tough question at me. Well, if it's going to be 7 p.m. Eastern, it will, for the race, I usually go exactly 2 hours before that. So it'll be 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific will be the pre-race pull. And man, I'm to stay sober until then.
Well, no one said you had to be sober, as long as you're not slurring as long as you're not slurring your words. I think that's more than acceptable to try and entertain the audience. But appreciate it as always. Should be a fun race this weekend at Richmond. Want to say a special thanks to Kurt Busch and his management team for letting him come on the show and making that possible. Hopefully the first, or I should say the second of many prominent interviews. I don't want to sell friend of the program, Danielle Trotta, short. I know we're efforting to get some more folks on there. And it's just so helpful to provide different perspective for all of us who get lost in the numbers and some of the minutia that are there. And you forget there are real humans driving these cars with real emotions and experience when we go to this variety of tracks. So to all of you guys and girls out there, hopefully you enjoy a Easter weekend that is extremely profitable on the college hardwoods and on the track. And come Sunday evening from Richmond Raceway in Richmond, Virginia, with a Denny Hamlin head-to-head matchup over William Byron. Ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.